In a quiet, sunlit neighborhood, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Lillian lived peacefully with her loyal German shepherd, Max. Their days were filled with simple joys until a shocking event turned their tranquil life into a story of courage and resilience. Lillian, with her silver hair and warm smile, was beloved by her neighbors, always ready with a kind word or a cup of tea. Max, ever vigilant, was more than just a pet. He was her guardian and friend. One fateful day, their bond would be tested as two white skinheads, filled with hatred, targeted Lillian, seeing her as an easy mark. But they had underestimated the fierce loyalty of Max, who would stop at nothing to protect his beloved owner. Mrs. Lillian lived in a small red brick house at the end of a quiet street on the outskirts of the city. She was a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, always ready with a smile for anyone who crossed her path. Known and adored by her neighbors, Mrs. Lillian was a central figure in the community, always willing to help with advice or a cup of hot tea. Her constant companion was Max, a German shepherd with a shiny coat and attentive gaze. Max was not just a guard dog. He was family to Mrs. Lillian, always by her side, watchful and friendly, always alert for any sign of danger. The two shared a special bond built on a history that few knew. Max had been adopted by Mrs. Lillian a few years ago. Found in an animal shelter, he was thin and scared, but something in his eyes touched the heart of the old lady. She knew that this dog had a strong spirit and that with love and care, he could flourish. Since then, Max had shown unwavering loyalty, protecting his owner from small dangers and bringing joy to her life. Mrs. Lillian's routine was simple. Every morning she tended to her garden, chatted with neighbors, and took long walks with Max around the neighborhood. During these walks, Max always stayed vigilant, sniffing the air and observing the surroundings, ready to intervene if there was any threat. On a particularly hot day, Mrs. Lillian went out to shop at the local market, taking Max with her. As they walked back home, carrying bags full of fresh vegetables and warm bread, she didn't notice that they were being watched. Two men, known in the neighborhood as the Incredible Bandits due to the audacity of their crimes, were eyeing her. These skinheads, filled with racial hatred, had heard about the old lady who lived alone with her dog and decided she would be an easy target. Planning a quick robbery, they followed Mrs. Lillian to her house, waiting for the right moment to strike. Upon arriving home, Mrs. Lillian placed the bags in the kitchen and began putting away the groceries. Max, as always, was by her side, but something was bothering him. He sniffed the air, his ears moving nervously. Suddenly, a muffled sound outside caught his attention. He growled softly, going to the front door and positioning himself protectively. Mrs. Lillian, noticing Max's uneasiness, went to the window to check. Before she could process what was happening, the door was violently kicked in, and two masked men entered the house, pushing her to the ground. The shock was so great that she barely had time to scream. The bandits started searching the house, looking for anything of value. They laughed and exchanged taunts, while Mrs. Lillian, fallen on the floor, tried to gather herself. But Max was not willing to let this happen. He lunged at the intruders, barking fiercely and baring his teeth. One of the bandits, surprised by the dog's reaction, tried to kick him, but Max dodged and bit the assailant's arm hard. The man screamed in pain, cursing and trying to break free. The other bandit, seeing the situation, pulled a knife from his pocket and advanced toward Max. Mrs. Lillian, still on the ground, watched the scene with a racing heart. She knew Max would fight to the end to protect her, but fear for her faithful companion consumed her. She tried to get up, but her knees trembled, and the pain in her hip made movement difficult. Max's bark echoed through the small house as he lunged at the second intruder. The knife-wielding man slashed wildly, but Max was too quick. He darted to the side, avoiding the blade, and clamped his jaws onto the man's leg. The man screamed, stumbling back and dropping the knife. Mrs. Lillian, still on the floor, managed to pull herself up enough to lean against the wall. Her heart pounded with fear and desperation. "Max, be careful," she shouted, her voice trembling, but Max was beyond hearing. He was in full protector mode, determined to drive these intruders away. The first man, nursing his bitten arm, grabbed a vase from a nearby table and hurled it at Max. The heavy object missed by inches, shattering against the wall. Max released his grip on the second man's leg and growled menacingly, his fur bristling. He positioned himself between Mrs. Lillian and the two men, ready for whatever came next. The men, now clearly panicked, exchanged a quick glance. "We need to get out of here," one of them muttered. But before they could make a move, Max charged again, snapping at their heels. The men bolted for the door, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. With the intruders gone, Max returned to Mrs. Lillian, who had finally managed to stand. She wrapped her arms around his neck, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Max. You saved me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Max licked her hand gently, his own way of reassuring her. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Mrs. Lillian sank into her favorite armchair, Max at her feet. The room was a mess, but she was safe, thanks to her loyal companion. As she stroked Max's head, memories flooded back to her. Memories of how Max had come into her life and all the times he had protected her. Years ago, after her husband passed away, Mrs. Lillian felt an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. Her daughter, concerned for her well-being, suggested she adopt a dog for companionship. Reluctantly, Mrs. Lillian agreed and visited the local animal shelter. That's where she first saw Max. Max was different from the other dogs. He was quiet, reserved, and his eyes held a depth of sadness that spoke to her. The shelter worker told her that Max had been found wandering the streets, malnourished and scared. There was something about him that tugged at her heartstrings, and she knew she had to take him home. From the day Max entered her home, things began to change. His presence brought comfort and a sense of security. He would follow her everywhere, always vigilant, always ready to protect. There were times when he chased off stray cats that wandered too close or barked at suspicious noises in the night. Each time, Max proved his worth and deepened the bond they shared. One particular incident stood out in her mind. A few months after adopting Max, Mrs. Lillian had fallen in the garden, unable to get up. She called out, and within moments, Max was by her side, barking furiously until a neighbor heard and came to help. It was then she realized just how much Max understood and cared for her. Now, as she looked into his loyal eyes, she knew without a doubt that adopting Max was one of the best decisions she had ever made. He wasn't just a pet. He was her guardian, her friend, and her hero. And today, once again, he had proven his unwavering loyalty and bravery. The night was unusually quiet as Mrs. Lillian and Max sat together, trying to find some semblance of calm after the harrowing events of the day. She had just started to drift off to sleep when a noise outside jolted her awake. Max, ever vigilant, was already on his feet, ears perked and alert. Through the thin curtains, Mrs. Lillian saw the shadows of the two men creeping around the side of the house. Her heart raced as she realized they had returned, this time determined to finish what they had started. "Max, we need to be ready," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. Max responded with a low growl, his muscles tense and ready for action. The front door rattled as the men tried to force it open again. This time, Mrs. Lillian grabbed the phone and quickly dialed the police, explaining the situation in hushed tones. "Please hurry," she urged before hanging up and turning her attention back to Max. The door finally gave way with a loud crash, and the men burst in, their faces twisted with anger and frustration. "Where is that damn dog?" one of them snarled, clutching a metal pipe. They hadn't expected Max to be ready for them. Max launched himself at the intruders with a ferocity that took them by surprise. He went straight for the man with the pipe, dodging the wild swings and sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The man screamed, dropping the pipe and trying to shake Max off. The second man, panicked and desperate, backed away, fumbling with something in his pocket. Before he could react, Max released his grip and charged at him, knocking him to the ground. The man's hand slipped out of his pocket, revealing a small knife that clattered to the floor. Mrs. Lillian, watching the scene unfold, felt a surge of pride and fear. "Hang on, Max," she whispered, praying for the police to arrive soon. Max continued his relentless assault, forcing the men to retreat toward the door. Just as it seemed Max had the upper hand, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men, realizing they were out of time, scrambled to their feet and bolted out the door, Max hot on their heels until they disappeared into the darkness. Moments later, the police arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Officers rushed in, guns drawn. But the immediate danger had passed. Max stood at the doorway, panting heavily but unharmed, his eyes still fixed on the path the intruders had taken. Mrs. Lillian sank into a chair, relief flooding through her as she recounted the events to the officers. They assured her they would do everything in their power to catch the men and ensure her safety. As the police secured the house and took statements, neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the commotion. Word of Max's bravery spread quickly, and soon the small crowd was buzzing with admiration for the loyal dog. One of the officers, after inspecting the scene, approached Mrs. Lillian. "Ma'am, your dog is incredible. He protected you bravely. We'll make sure you're safe, but you have one remarkable guardian here." Mrs. Lillian looked down at Max, who was now sitting calmly at her feet, and smiled through her tears. "Yes, I know. He's my hero," she said softly, reaching down to stroke his head. In the days that followed, Mrs. Lillian's house became a symbol of bravery in the neighborhood. Friends and neighbors visited frequently, bringing food and offering help with repairs. Max was treated like a local hero, receiving treats and pats from everyone who came by. The bond between Mrs. Lillian and Max only grew stronger after that night. She knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. Max had proven time and again that his loyalty and courage were boundless, and for that, Mrs. Lillian was eternally grateful. As the sun set on another day, Mrs. Lillian sat on her porch with Max by her side, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. She knew they had been through a terrifying ordeal, but she also knew that with Max beside her, she could face anything. Together, they watched the neighborhood settle into the peaceful evening, knowing that their unbreakable bond had only grown stronger. The days turned into weeks, and life gradually returned to normal for Mrs. Lillian and Max. The neighborhood remained abuzz with the tale of Max's heroics, and the old woman and her loyal dog became local legends. Children would often ask their parents to pass by Mrs. Lillian's house just to catch a glimpse of the brave dog who had saved his beloved owner. Mrs. Lillian, ever the gracious hostess, welcomed visitors with open arms. She would recount the story of that fateful night with a mix of pride and gratitude, always emphasizing the bravery and loyalty of Max. For Max, every visitor was a new friend, and he basked in the attention and affection, always remaining alert and protective. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Lillian sat on her porch, Max lying contentedly at her feet. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in her front yard. She gazed out at the neighborhood, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fear and danger of that night seemed a distant memory, replaced by the warmth and security of the present. Her thoughts turned to the lessons she had learned. In Max, she had found not just a pet, but a protector, a companion, and a true friend. His unwavering loyalty and courage had taught her the depths of an animal's love and the extraordinary bond that can form between humans and their pets. She thought about the importance of adopting animals in need, knowing that Max had come into her life from a place of abandonment and fear only to become her greatest protector. Mrs. Lillian knew that their story carried a message for everyone. It was a story of resilience, trust, and the incredible things that can happen when you open your heart to love. She hoped that those who heard their story would be inspired to look beyond the surface, to see the potential for greatness in every creature, and to understand the profound impact of compassion and care. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Mrs. Lillian looked down at Max and smiled. "You know, Max, you've shown me what true bravery looks like. You're not just my dog, you're my hero," she said, her voice filled with affection. Max lifted his head and looked at her with his soulful eyes, as if understanding every word. He inched closer, resting his head on her lap, his presence a constant reminder of the love and protection he offered. The days ahead were filled with peace and a deeper sense of connection. Mrs. Lillian continued to care for her garden, take her walks, and enjoy the company of her neighbors, always with Max by her side. Their bond, forged in moments of crisis and strengthened by daily acts of love, was unbreakable. In the quiet moments of the evening, as Mrs. Lillian sat with Max, watching the world go by, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She knew that no matter what challenges the future held, she and Max would face them together, and that was all the assurance she needed. The story of Mrs. Lillian and Max spread beyond their neighborhood, touching the hearts of many and inspiring acts of kindness and bravery. It was a testament to the power of love and the extraordinary bond between a woman and her dog, a story that would be remembered and cherished for years to come. As time went on, Mrs. Lillian and Max continued to live their lives, sharing their love and strength with all who crossed their path. Their story became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that even in the face of adversity, love and loyalty could prevail, and that true heroes often come in the most unexpected forms.